could call this morning's subject happiness. What is happiness? But the title isn't important. God did seem in the night, I think Thursday night, to make a phrase real to me, though like so many other things you wonder what did he say to you, but it certainly was very real when it seemed Jesus spoke it himself, to me. And it's the phrase in John chapter 15, if you like to look at it. And it's the last verse that we read, John 15 and verse 11, and it isn't even the first part of it, though Jesus does say, after he says, abide in me and I am the vine and you are the branches, he then says, these things I have spoken to you. That is, all those things that I've just said, I've spoken to you. But what he seemed to say to me somewhere in the twilight hours or in the middle of the night, that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be full. And it just seemed to come so vividly to me that that's why I'm saying it this morning, because I want to share what God says and not what I say. That my joy may be in you and that your joy may be full. And it seemed obvious to me that he was saying, the joy that I have, that's the joy that is to be in you, my joy. And then your joy, your own joy, will be full. And that's the way our life will work together. And I looked up in the Greek, the word for joy, and it's, I think it's chara, C-H-A-R-A in English, and it means cheerfulness or a calm delight. So, of course, it's not whoopity-whoop joy, but it's just a calm delight that is always with you, whatever. And Jesus is saying, that is the joy that I have. And that is the joy that is in you if you are in me, and you are in me. So that's the joy that you will have, my joy. I think our trouble is that we've been used to eating the food that the swine eat. I think we've been used to make-do joys, so that we're almost addicts to those joys. And not only addicts, but it's a bit the same story as they found in introducing instant coffee here in America. Eventually Americans would start saying that isn't real coffee, because they got so used to instant coffee that when somebody brewed coffee they thought, oh, that isn't real coffee. It's a bit like that. We get so used to the substitute joys that we can't conceive of the real joy, and often the real joy doesn't seem terribly joyful to us, in spite of the fact that the substitute joys that we have turn out to be very superficial and shallow and transient too. But we kind of get used to them and we get addicted to them. And so this joy that Jesus talks about at first sight seems kind of boring, well, a calm delight, that's what it is, Indeed, one of the definitions is cheerfulness, and we kind of feel, cheerful. We used to have a program on English radio, and this person used to say, it's being so cheerful keeps me going, and of course he wasn't cheerful at all. And so often we think of cheerfulness as kind of, keep your heart up, be as happy as you can. And so often we think of cheerfulness or calm delight as, well, it's okay, but it's not nearly as wonderful as great football match or an exciting ride on water skis or all the other wonderful things we could do here on earth. And so I think that a great deal of our difficulty in finally going for Jesus' joy is we do have so many other joys that we've kind of got used to. And yet we know in our hearts, we do know that they are often based on no reality. And they are often based on just the fact that this experience is new to us. So Paris is exciting the first time you see it, but you get used to it after a while. And so many of what we call joys are kind of transient things that are almost more dependent on the surprise factor than on any real deep reality that is in them. And yet we all know, we joke with each other about treats, I'll have a little frozen yogurt, or I'll have this little experience or that little experience, or we'll have our chocolate chip cookies, or something that will give us a little bit of a lift. And we have all kinds of little things that we kind of live off. And yet they have shortcomings too, because there are certain situations that occur in our lives that they don't succeed in helping us with. And there are certain dreadful, we call them dreadful experiences, or disasters, or death of people whom we love, or difficulties with finances, or problems with our job, or all kinds of other little issues. And those joys are no use to us at that moment. They do not provide the calm delight that is able to face everything with absolute equanimity and peace. And so we know in our own hearts that the joys that we've got used to don't actually succeed in helping us when life gets hard. But we are used to them. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have difficulty with this joy that Jesus talks about. His joy is absolutely and utterly different from what we in this fallen world call joy. And what I saw was part of our difficulty is right there. We keep thinking, surely the things that we think of as joy, surely there is some element of real joy in them. Well, I think there isn't. I think probably there isn't. The joys that we fallen people in this fallen world have got used to appreciating or have got used to living off are utterly different from the joy that is real and true and lasting. And that is the joy that Jesus talks about. I think that's the first important thing to grasp. That the joy that Jesus talks about here in this verse, that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be full, the first truth is the joy that he's talking about is utterly different from the joys that we talk about. The little happinesses that we have, the little satisfaction which we have with this experience of this nice meal or this exciting ride in a glider or these nice people that we have conversation with or these circumstances that seem to be going well for us financially. It's utterly different from all those things that we often call joy, yet we're probably all prepared to call them happiness. We say, oh yes, happiness is satisfaction with what happens to you. And so often that's what we human beings are talking about. When we talk about joy, we're talking about happiness rather than joy. That's the first thing, I think. The joy Jesus has is utterly different from the joy that we talk about. I think that's why the Bible so often connects his joy up with sorrow and sadness. I think the Bible is always, or God in his word, is always trying to point out to us, look, you're never going to seek true joy, the joy that is in my heart, and the joy that is in my son's heart, and the joy that actually, because my son is in you, I have planted deep down within you too. You will never seek that. You will never experience it or enjoy it until you've put away those other joys. Until you have, in fact, come into mourning or sadness, as the world calls happiness. And I just have a few of those verses, but John 16 and 20. It's just the next chapter. John 16 and 20. Truly, truly, I say to you, you will weep and lament, but the world will rejoice. You will be sorrowful, but your sorrow will turn into joy. Now, I won't begin to interpret all the complexity or depth of that verse, but you can see that God is saying there has to come a time when the world rejoices, and yet you are not rejoicing. You're sorrowful. And because you are sorrowful and aren't rejoicing in the way the world rejoices, you yourself will eventually experience joy. Now, I won't go on with that verse because it's obviously deep. But at least God is saying there is going to come a time, or there has to come a time in your life, when what makes the world rejoice does not make you rejoice. And indeed, you actually come to the place where you see those things are no longer the source of joy. Those things are no longer the thing that gives me joy. Indeed, you have to come to the place where those things no longer do give you joy. Where you come to the end of the happiness or the contentment or the satisfaction that those things bring you, and you face nothingness. It's as if God is saying, it seems to me, you come to a place of reality where you see that there is no truth in all those things. There is, yes, the chocolate chip cookie gives me a momentary satisfaction, or water skiing gives me a little bit of a thrill, or having a nice conversation with people gives me a little enjoyment, but eventually you come to the place where, no, those things, I've experienced them before. There is a limit to how deep those can go inside me. There's a limit to what happiness those things can bring me. No, all of that is meaningless. People pass away. Conversations pass away. Indeed, the little bit of excitement or interest that I get from those, I can see it's just temporary. It's just a little kick. It's just a little thrill. It just passes. You know, if you said to me, do you mean that we would ever come to a place where we're kind of bored with all those things? Ireneo has often mentioned that George Saunders, we joked about George Saunders because he was a British film star who was a very smooth, sophisticated gentleman. Did everything just smoothly, you know, always had the flowers for the lady and always handed her the drinks in the right way. And of course, as I would tumble over something or be clumsy about something, you know, as I would go into a restaurant and either hold her in his chair or know what the waiter was saying to me or not, I would say, yeah, George Saunders all over again, you know. And we would joke about George Saunders, but eventually, when he died, Irini quoted what they said in the newspaper. He said, "I'm so bored with life." And of course, to us it seemed dreadful, you know, because we don't think that he had, we don't think he said it from the point of view of belief in God at all. We thought it was a tragedy, you know. It was a man who had spent maybe his whole life, it's not fair maybe to judge him, but maybe he had spent a lot of his life on the surface or enjoying what the world calls happiness. If you say to me, do you mean that you have to perhaps come to a place where you get bored with it all before you'll seek the joy that Jesus has? I think that's perhaps true. I think that is perhaps true. I know we all like to think we can have our cake and eat it. That you can keep your cake, keep it complete and and full, and yet eat it at the same time. And we know the danger of our society is to persuade each other that of course you can do wrong and still live. You can have everything. But Jesus doesn't say that, you know. He often says, look, if you love father and mother more than me, you are not worthy of me. He's always saying, you know, you have to choose this or that. And the Bible itself, you know, is saying if Baal be God, then choose him. If God be God, then choose him. But you have to make a choice. Yes, I think that's at the back of these verses in the Bible that say, first, you have to come to the place where you mourn, or you are sorrowful, or you see that the joys that you've lived off so far are meaningless, and you at last see that they're meaningless, and lo and behold, you see, then what is there? There's nothing. And until we come to that, we probably will not seek the joy that Jesus himself has. Probably the truth is, we will only finally go to Jesus when we're desperate because we see, to whom else would we go? Lord, thou hast the words of eternal life. Only then will we come to him with such a whole and complete heart and hunger that he will actually manifest his joy inside us. So, you know, think about it. There are some other verses, 2 Corinthians 7 and 4. There are many of them, but I thought I'd just mention a few because it is so startling the way God juxtaposes joy with sadness. 2 Corinthians 7 and verse 4, I have great confidence in you. I have great pride in you. I am filled with comfort. With all our affliction, I am overjoyed. And it's again, you know, it's that juxtaposition of the affliction. Obviously, it was the persecution and the trials that Paul was going through. And he said, in the midst of all this affliction, I am overjoyed. And we here in this room, we know ourselves well and truly. And we know that is where the rubber meets the road. That is exactly where we live. We find that when affliction comes, the joy goes. I mean, we've often said to one another, well, now I know God is in charge, I know he's in control, and I have faith, but it's just, and we get to that but it's just, I was caught off guard, or things seemed so black, or it seemed things were not working out. And whatever it is, we find that the joys of the chocolate chip cookies, or the joys of the good conversation, or the joys of the friendship, or the joys that we experience on holiday, all the things that we call joy, they seem not to be present in the midst of affliction. We seem not to be able to say, with all our affliction I am overjoyed. We rather say, with all our affliction, I forget all the joys that I've had. And somehow I do not have a calm delight in the midst of my affliction. It seems, that in some way God is saying, the joy that my son has is a joy that continues in the midst of affliction. So it is something that is independent of the so-called joys that we are used to. And unless you put away those toys, a bit like when I was a child, I spoke in childish ways, but now I'm a man, now I'm a woman, I put away childish things. Unless you put away those childish toys, you cannot enter into the manhood or the womanhood of my son. You cannot. Hebrews 10 and 34. Hebrews 10 and 34. For you had compassion on the prisoners, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property. I remember, I think, Sandra, it was I may be misquoting you, and I apologize on the video if I am, but I think it was you had jewelry stolen, or maybe, I think it was you. But it's just an example. Any of us could think of moments when we've either lost jewelry or lost something of our own. But we've experienced, a plundering of our property. Joyfully. Joyfully. Oh, if we're honest with each other, we probably would all say, well, I wouldn't say joyfully. I wouldn't say I joyfully accepted the plundering of my property. I'd say after the first shock and moment of worry and anxiety, I probably gathered myself together and thought, well, trust in the Lord and don't despair. He is a friend so true. God knows all things and he will supply. And I probably gathered myself together and philosophized a bit and got some peace about it. But joyfully accepted. Joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better position and an abiding one. But you can see that in the Bible, God is always juxtaposing this joy, not with good circumstances, not with good things happening to us, which is usually the way we think of joy, but he's always juxtaposing it with things that mean the destruction of what we call joys, the elimination of what we call joys. He's always talking about his joy as something that blossoms in the midst of an absence of what we call joys. So you can see that it's really different. There is a great contrast. It's very difficult to say Jesus' joy is something that he kindly adds to our joy as kind of icing on the cake. As if we have all this in heaven too, you know. We have all this fun and we get heaven as well. In no way is this what God is talking about when he talks about joy. He's obviously talking about a deep joy that is only possible to people who have finally come to the place where they don't regard those things as joys, where they do not get their kick from those things, where indeed they have come to the place where they see through all those things. They see the terrible emptiness of those, not only see the terrible emptiness of them in a kind of philosophical, safe, secure way, but they see the emptiness of them with eyes that have been drained of the happiness that comes from those things. If you like to say, do you mean like George Saunders on his deathbed? I think that it's that kind of thing, where you come to the place where you see this holds nothing for me. This is kind of boring. This isn't happiness. Is there happiness anywhere? Is there anything lasting? Then a voice comes. My joy will be in you, and your joy will be full. It seems to me that's it, you know. I don't think it's any less than that. James 1:2, of course, is the well-known one. James 1 and verse 2. Count it all joy, my brethren, when you meet various trials. Well, I don't know how often you've quoted that verse. I know the hundreds of times I've quoted it, verbally and to myself. Count it all joy, my brethren, when you meet various trials. And I mean, it just seems an absolute paradox. It just seems incomprehensible. I mean, however much you try to encourage yourself to see, well, that's God's word, you know, and we ought to believe that, and that's the way we ought to think. It just seems so. I cannot say the word because it's his holy word. But it seems so stupid, you know. It seems that can't be true. Count it joy when you meet various trials. It's a contradiction. Trial means unhappiness. Trial means a lack of joy. How can you count it joy when you enter into various trials? But do you see that it is God saying so plainly that real joy that is in my son's heart is only possible when the trials that you are going through have separated you absolutely and utterly from any hope of happiness in this world. Trials mean for all of us in this earthly world, trials mean things that take away from us the normal comforts or the normal encouragements or the normal reassurances that we receive from the world. It usually means the failure or the absence or the disappearance of some of the things that we normally depend on. A trial, a financial trial, is when we don't have the money that we need. A family trial is when family suddenly seems no longer to be our stay and our strength and our comfort. A friendship trial is when you lose a friend. Normally what we mean by trials, we mean things that take away from us the worldly circumstances, things, and people that make life bearable. And God says, count it as joy when you come into that situation. Only then will you be in a position where you are able to hear my Son. Where you are able to hear my Son speak to you. And where you are able to suddenly see that his joy is the only joy in the whole universe. And you can have that joy only because you are part of him, part of his heart, and want to feel what his heart feels, and want to experience what he experiences. Only when you want him as badly as that will his joy begin to be manifested in you. And there's no mystery about his joy. His joy is not in ice cream. His joy is not in loyal, faithful friends. His joy is not in comfortable living situation. His joy is not in security about his worldly future. His joy is not in this experience of thrill or excitement. His joy is in one place only. And there are almost, I would say, as many verses that say this as talk about joy being juxtaposed with affliction and with trial. Rejoice in the Lord always. The Magnificat, Mary rejoicing in God my Savior. All through the Bible, Jesus enjoys his dear Father. He is full of joy in his Father. He is full of joy in his Father. His joy is in his dear Father. That's the only joy that is possible. And it says, bewildering and baffling and beyond explanation as the joy that one person has in falling in love with another person. It's the joy that friends have when they sit opposite each other and they're not getting anything from each other. They're not giving each other money. They're not giving each other ice cream. They're not giving each other thrills and excitement. They're just there with each other. It's that joy that Jesus has. And the whole purpose of this world was so that we would look through all these things, look behind Santa Claus's beard, look behind his red cloak, look behind his reindeers, look behind his trees, look behind his lakes, look behind his skies, look behind his gold and his silver and his money and his rivers and his oceans and his waves, and see, there he is. My dear, and forgive me using the word, my dear and darling Father. There he is. There is my Father. And we are part of his only begotten Son, Jesus. And as we yearn for Jesus and hug him to our hearts, because we have nothing else, and that's the only way we'll ever grasp him in that way, because we have nothing else, we hug him to ourselves with all our being, and lo and behold, his joy in his Father fills our hearts, and we find ourselves enjoying the joy that Jesus has in his dear Father. That's it. That's it. And it won't come any other way. Because that joy is joy in God. And you and I can't get that joy from trying just to get through the beard and the red cloak and the waves and the trees and the mountains. We can't get through that with our little miniature minds. We can't get through that to our Father. That's why there is no way to come to the Father but by me, by Jesus. There is no way through to the Father but by Jesus. We cannot get straight to him. We hug the Savior to ourselves. Hug him? We don't need to. He is in us. He said, "Thou, Father, art in me, and I am in them." He said to us in John 15, "Abide in me, and I in you. My Father has created you in me for good works, which he has prepared beforehand that you should walk in." You are in me. You are individually members of my body. You are part of me. Remain in me. Seek me alone with all your heart, and my joy will rise inside you. But I think we are made so that we have to say first no to the other joys. Until we've really come to the end of those, I don't think we can hear him speaking. I think we hear the words, "My joy may be in you, and your joy may be full," and we think, "Oh, goody, goody, a little of that would help too." But we're glad, we're pretty happy, reasonably happy, despite some of the evil things in the world. We're reasonably happy, but that's good. I'm glad that I'll have a little of this too. So I think that the only way, finally, that we will be happy is if we come to the place where we hear Jesus himself say to us, "My joy I give you. My joy is in you. And your joy now will be full."